They say a man's biggest cage ain't the four walls of his house, or the shift he punches every morning. Nah, the toughest bars are often the ones he builds inside his own head. A quiet kind of prison where the guards are made of doubt and the warden's name is fear. And for some men, that prison grows so tight, they forget there's even a world outside its walls. They just walk through life, heads down, doing their duty, never quite sure if they're living or just passing through. But sometimes, even in the smallest, quietest corners of this world, a man finds a key he didn't know he had. And sometimes that key is forged in the very thing that locked him up in the first place. Take Chester, for instance. 48 years old, solid as a brick, and smelled perpetually of hydraulic oil and ambition he mostly kept bottled up. He was one of those guys you saw every day at the plant but never really saw, not because he wasn't there, mind you. Oh, Chester was always there. First one in, last one out. He worked the third shift mostly, tending to the massive presses that stamped out parts for everything from washing machines to tractors. A factory man through and through. His face was a road map of the years. Faint lines around eyes that perpetually squinted, as if trying to decipher some invisible code in the air or maybe just avoid direct contact. He had that look of a man who'd perfected the art of observing without being observed, a quiet intensity burning just beneath the surface. His hands, though, you could read a whole history in Chester's hands. Knuckles thick and gnarled from years of wrestling with stubborn machinery, fingers stained with grease and tiny scars from unforgiving metal. They were practical hands, capable hands, hands that understood the precise torque of a bolt and the delicate balance of a jig. But if you looked real close, past the calluses and the grime, there was a tremor there, a slight hesitation in the way they sometimes rested, almost nervously, on a toolbox or a coffee cup. They told a story of hard work, sure, but also of a constant, quiet internal vigilance. Like they were always ready to fix something, but also ready to retreat to pull back from the world. He was the kind of fellow who'd walk into the break room, fill his mug, and then find the single empty chair tucked away in the farthest corner, facing the wall if he could manage it. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually a direct answer to a direct question, delivered in a low, even tone that rarely carried past the person he was addressing. Some folks at the plant mistook it for aloofness or maybe just plain unfriendliness. They'd say, "Chester's a good worker, but quiet as a mouse." They weren't wrong about the quiet part, but they didn't know that inside that quiet, reserved man was a whole stadium of worry, a constant chatter of what-ifs and should-haves that played on an endless loop. He wasn't detached. He was just trying to manage the overwhelming static of human interaction. Every casual glance, every offhand comment, every potential misstep felt like a high-stakes performance he hadn't rehearsed for. So he kept to himself, meticulously organized his tools, and poured all his nervous energy into making sure his work, at least, was beyond reproach. It was the one place he felt he could truly control things. There are some men who walk among us, their presence a whisper, their lives a quiet hum in the background. You might not notice them at first, not because there's nothing to see, but because they've perfected the art of not being seen. They're the ones perpetually on the edges, observing, listening, processing a world that often feels too loud, too bright, too demanding of a stage performance they never rehearsed. For them, every glance holds judgment, every word a potential misstep. They carry the weight of unseen expectations, and in response, they learn to fold themselves into the scenery, believing it's safer there, hidden from the spotlight's glare. They build their own silent castles, brick by brick, not of stone, but of avoidance and meticulous, often anxious, preparation. This is a story about one such man and how the very walls he built around himself became the foundation for something extraordinary. That man was Chester, 48 years old, a factory man through and through, not the kind who slapped backs or told booming jokes. Chester moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours on the factory floor, but also of a deeper, more ingrained habit, the desire to occupy as little space as possible. His steel-toed boots echoed faintly on the concrete, a rhythm almost swallowed by the clatter and hum of machinery. He wasn't trying to be rude. He was simply trying to be invisible. You'd see him, if you paid close enough attention, at the periphery of every group, a silent sentinel, perpetually observing from the edges. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, even when they looked tired, and they often looked tired, not just from the grind of the early shift, but from the constant internal vigilance, the endless self-monitoring that ran beneath his calm surface. His hands, tough and scarred from years of gripping wrenches and wrestling stubborn parts, bore the indelible marks of his trade. and beneath the calluses and the grime there was a tremor there, a slight hesitation in the way they sometimes rested, almost nervously, on a toolbox or a coffee cup. They told a story of hard work, sure, but also of a constant, quiet internal vigilance. Like they were always ready to fix something, but also ready to retreat to pull back from the world. He was the kind of fellow who'd walk into the break room, fill his mug, and then find the single empty chair tucked away in the farthest corner, facing the wall if he could manage it. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was usually a direct answer to a direct question, delivered in a low, even tone that rarely carried past the person he was addressing. Some folks at the plant mistook it for aloofness or maybe just plain unfriendliness. They'd say, "Chester's a good worker, but quiet as a mouse." They weren't wrong about the quiet part, but they didn't know that inside that quiet, reserved man was a whole stadium of worry, a constant chatter of what-ifs and should-haves that played on an endless loop. He wasn't detached. He was just trying to manage the overwhelming static of human interaction. Every casual glance, every offhand comment, every potential misstep felt like a high-stakes performance he hadn't rehearsed for. So he kept to himself, meticulously organized his tools, and poured all his nervous energy into making sure his work, at least, was beyond reproach. It was the one place he felt he could truly control things. That meticulousness wasn't just a habit, it was a fortress. Each bolt tight to spec, each wire precisely routed, each lever greased just so, these were small victories in a life where social interactions felt like colossal failures waiting to happen. He understood machines, their logic was clear, predictable. People were a tangled mess of unspoken rules and shifting expectations, a minefield Chester navigated by simply trying not to step anywhere. His shyness wasn't merely a preference for solitude. It was a living, breathing thing that curled in his gut, a tightening band around his chest whenever an unexpected conversation loomed. He'd practiced countless scenarios in his head, entire dialogues unfolding with perfect wit and confidence, only for the real moment to arrive and his tongue to stick to the roof of his mouth, his thoughts scattering like startled birds. He'd stand there, nodding vaguely, offering a grunt or a shrug, while the brilliant repartee he'd just constructed in his mind evaporated, leaving him feeling foolish and defeated. It was a familiar pattern, one that had cost him more than just casual friendships. Promotions, collaborative projects, even just a simple suggestion during a team meeting. These opportunities had often slipped through his quiet fingers, not because he lacked the insight or the capability, but because the mere thought of speaking up, of drawing attention to himself, felt like staring into a blinding spotlight. He preferred to let others take the credit, to watch from the periphery, his ideas often voiced by bolder colleagues who never knew where the initial spark truly came from. His world in many ways was a small, well-defined circle, enforced not by external walls, but by the invisible yet crushing weight of his own apprehension. It was a cage, built not by bars, but by unsaid words and untaken chances, limiting his potential, shrinking his horizons with every avoided glance and silent retreat. He felt the ache of it, this constant suppression, this living on the sidelines, a deep-seated fear of judgment that whispered lies of inadequacy into his ear, convincing him that invisibility was his safest, and perhaps only, option. Every workday for Chester started with the unceremonious clang of an alarm clock at 5 in the morning, a sound so familiar it was less a jolt and more an internal tremor. It wasn't a digital chime or a soothing melody, but an old-school twin bell bought used years ago that cut through the silence of his small house with industrial precision. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, the chill a brief punctuation mark before the ritual began. Coffee, black and strong, brewed in a drip machine that whistled like a tired old kettle. Toast, always just one slice, eaten standing over the sink, his eyes tracing the faint water stains in the porcelain. His house, modest and older, sat on a street where every porch looked much like the next, a testament to decades of working hands and quiet lives. No grand aspirations here, just sturdy brick and sensible shrubs. Chester kept it immaculate, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the factory floor. Every book on his small shelf was aligned, every tool in his shed hung in its designated spot, every bill neatly stacked on the corner of his kitchen table, waiting for the once-a-month reckoning. He paid them all on time, every time, though some months it was tighter than a new piston in a cylinder. The gas bill, the electric, the mortgage on a house he'd inherited from his folks. They were constant, unwavering demands, requiring his unwavering presence at the plant. The commute was short, 10 minutes in his serviceable, decade-old sedan, the engine purring a monotonous tune he knew better than most pop songs. He'd arrive early, as always, clock in precisely on the minute, and walk onto the factory floor where the air hung heavy with the tang of grease, ozone, and metal dust. For 48 years, Chester had navigated this world, pushing himself through the relentless hum and clatter of machinery. His job was to operate a CNC milling machine, guiding it with the delicate precision of a surgeon, churning out parts for heavy industrial equipment. Day in, day out, it was the same rhythm. Load the raw material, press the sequence, monitor the cut, unload the finished piece, inspect. Repeat. Hours bled into each other, defined by the rhythmic clang of the hydraulic press nearby, the whir of grinding wheels, the distant shouts of forklift drivers. It wasn't glorious work, not the kind you saw in movies, but it was honest. And he was good at it. Damn good. His output was consistently high, his error rate practically non-existent. Yet, as the machines roared and vibrated around him, a quieter, more insistent hum reverberated within Chester. He moved through his days like a ghost, an observer, meticulous in his tasks but absent in spirit. There was a hollow ache, a quiet thrumming beneath his ribs that spoke of unfulfilled potential, of roads not taken. When he looked at his reflection in the smudged factory window, those tired, observant eyes, the slight slump of shoulders that suggested a constant readiness to disappear, he didn't see the man he'd imagined as a boy. As a young man, Chester had dreams, not grand, world-changing ambitions, but quiet, deeply personal ones. He wanted to build things, real things, not just operate the machines that made pieces of them. Maybe open a small woodworking shop, or even teach a trade, sharing the intricate knowledge of how things worked, how to make something with your own hands that lasted. He had a fascination with engineering, with solving complex puzzles, a keen analytical mind that could deconstruct a broken engine or a failing production line in minutes. Could see solutions, envision improvements, understand the why behind the what. But these were thoughts for late nights, for the quiet solitude of his living room, surrounded by well-worn books on mechanics and forgotten blueprints. They were buried deep beneath layers of self-doubt and the crushing weight of that pervasive shyness. That was the gap. The chasm between the intelligent, capable man who existed within the confines of his own mind and the nearly invisible man who walked through the world. The man who could instinctively troubleshoot a complex machine breakdown, yet couldn't comfortably ask for a refill at a diner. The man who craved the satisfaction of leadership, of seeing his carefully crafted plans come to fruition, but shrank from the very thought of presenting those plans to a room full of people. He knew he was competent, more than competent, but the belief that others wouldn't see it, that his ideas would be dismissed, or worse, that he himself would falter in the delivery, kept him silent. His meticulously organized home, his flawless work record, these were his quiet proofs of worth, the only ways he knew how to express his competence without having to actually speak about it. He yearned for mastery, not for recognition, but for the internal satisfaction of a job done perfectly, a problem solved elegantly. Yet, the price of that quiet mastery was a life lived largely in the shadows, always on the edge of the spotlight, never quite daring to step into its glare. And he felt the cost of it every single day. He was elbow-deep in grease, troubleshooting a stuttering hydraulic press on line 7 when the summons came. "Chester, Mr. Henderson wants to see you in his office. Now." The foreman, Big Mike, grunted the words, already moving on. Chester wiped his hands on a rag, a familiar knot tightening in his stomach. Henderson's office usually meant trouble, or at least something beyond the usual humdrum. The plant manager's office was always too bright, too quiet, too clean for a factory. Henderson, a man whose patience was as thin as his hair, sat behind his imposing metal desk, a stack of blueprints laid out before him. He gestured to the chair opposite. "Chester, sit." Chester eased himself down, trying to appear nonchalant, but his heart was already thudding against his ribs. He prepared himself for a lecture about a delayed part or perhaps a new, more tedious assignment. "Look, Chester," Henderson began, pushing the blueprints forward. "We've got a problem. Line 4 needs a complete retooling. It's a mess. The old spec sheets are useless and the new equipment isn't meshing with what we've got. It's complex, a real puzzle." He leaned back, his eyes, usually narrowed in perpetual irritation, studying Chester with an uncharacteristic glint. "I want you to lead it." The words hit Chester like a physical blow. "Lead it." The blood drained from his face. His carefully constructed wall of invisibility began to crumble. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The familiar panic clawed at his throat. He could almost hear his own rehearsed excuses forming. I'm not a leader. I prefer to work alone. I'm better with machines than people. Henderson, seemingly anticipating his protest, cut him off. Before you say anything, I know you're not one for speeches, Chester, but you're the most meticulous man in this damn plant. Your attention to detail, your ability to reverse engineer anything, it's unmatched. We need someone who can untangle this spaghetti bowl of wires and parts, someone who will pore over every last nut and bolt until it makes sense. That's you? He paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't about glad-handing. It's about getting the job done right. And frankly, if you don't take this, I don't know who else can. We're talking about significant downtime, major revenue loss if this isn't handled perfectly. Chester looked at the blueprints, then at Henderson's expectant face. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and a flicker of something else, a deep, almost forgotten yearning. This wasn't about charming colleagues, it was about mastery. It was about proving his worth through the very skills he possessed, skills that didn't require a booming voice or a winning smile. This was a chance to solve a grand, intricate puzzle to bring order from chaos, and Henderson, against all odds, seemed to see that in him. He swallowed hard. The familiar terror was still there, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant spark ignited. He had spent his whole life avoiding this, avoiding anything that put him in a position where he might be judged, where he might have to speak, to lead. He de-built a cage around himself, brick by brick, out of shyness and fear. If he said no now, if he retreated into the shadows again, he knew with a chilling certainty he'd be stuck there forever. The quiet life he'd carved out for himself would become his permanent prison. His voice, when it came out, was a rasp. "All right, Mr. Henderson." He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. "I'll take it." Henderson simply grunted, a satisfied nod. "Good. The briefing is Monday morning. Be ready." Chester walked out of that office feeling both terrified and strangely, thrillingly alive. He hadn't just agreed to lead a project, he'd agreed to face himself. That night, the silence of his modest home wasn't comforting, it was deafening. Chester lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the glowing green numbers of his alarm clock mocking him. 3:17 a.m. Sleep was an impossible luxury. His mind churned, replaying the conversation with Henderson, dissecting every word, every nuance. The initial flush of defiant resolve had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of dread. "What have you done, Chester?" The thought echoed in the empty rooms of his mind. "You idiot, you actually said yes." He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The linoleum floor was cold beneath his bare feet. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the small, impeccably clean table. The moonlight filtered through the window, painting the room in shades of silver and gray. Everything in his home was in its place just like he liked it, a reflection of his desperate need for control in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. But tonight, that order felt fragile, a thin veneer over a roaring storm. He clasped his hands, calloused and strong, in front of him. They were good hands, hands that could fix things, build things, understand the intricate workings of machines. But they weren't hands that could shake confidently or gesture persuasively in a meeting. And his mind, so adept at solving mechanical puzzles, was now trapped in a loop of hypothetical social failures. He thought about all the chances he'd let slip away. The foreman position that had gone to a louder, less competent man. The factory committee he could have joined, bringing his practical insights to the table. The friendships that never quite blossomed because he couldn't push past the awkward initial conversations. 48 years old, and what did he have to show for it beyond a spotless work record and a carefully managed house? No family waiting for him, no loud laughter echoing through these rooms, no shared stories. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet ticking of the cheap wall clock. A raw, bitter honesty settled over him. His life had become a carefully constructed evasion. He had excelled at making himself small, at being overlooked, at blending into the background. And for what? So he wouldn't feel the sting of judgment? The discomfort of a misplaced word? He'd avoided the small pains of social interaction, and in doing so had carved out a life devoid of many of its joys and triumphs. He was a master of his domain, but his domain was shrinking, confined to the safe, predictable spaces he allowed himself. The Line 4 project wasn't just a retooling anymore. It felt like a mirror, reflecting back his deepest fears, his most profound regrets. This wasn't just about the gears and the wires. It was about the man who was supposed to lead the team of engineers and technicians. It was about him having to articulate his vision, delegate tasks, answer questions, stand firm. The very thought made his stomach clench. He could feel the familiar tremor starting in his hands. Could he do it? Could he really step into that glare, even for a project as technically demanding as this? Or would he, as always, find a way to retreat, to minimize his role, to hide behind the blueprints and let someone else take the public face? The idea of failing, of proving all his self-doubt correct, was terrifying. But the idea of not even trying, of letting this chance slip through his fingers just like all the others, felt even worse. It felt like dying a little more inside, permanently. He was tired of running. He was just so damn tired of running. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and industrial, just like most Tuesdays at the plant. The intercom crackled, spitting out Chester's name, asking him to report to Mr. Henderson's office. Chester's stomach did its usual flip. Mr. Henderson, the plant manager, wasn't one for pleasantries. An unscheduled summons usually meant trouble, or at least an awkward conversation. Chester straightened his faded work shirt, tried to smooth down his hair, and walked the familiar path, each step heavy with apprehension. Mr. Henderson's office was surprisingly neat for a man who oversaw a symphony of controlled chaos. The air smelled of old coffee and a faint metallic tang from the factory floor outside. Henderson sat behind a large, scarred oak desk, blueprints spread out before him like sacred texts. He looked up as Chester entered, his gaze steady, assessing. It wasn't unkind, but it was direct, leaving no room for Chester to disappear into the wallpaper. "Chester, shut the door," Henderson rumbled, his voice a low growl that always seemed to cut through the din of the factory. Chester did as he was told, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. He stood awkwardly by the door, hands clasped behind his back, a posture he'd perfected for looking attentive while simultaneously making himself as small as possible. "Sit," Henderson commanded, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Chester sat, perching on the edge, ready to spring up at a moment's notice. Henderson leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, pushing the blueprints aside. "You know about the line 4 retooling, right?" Chester nodded, a tight, economical movement. He knew the schematics backwards and forwards, knew the potential pitfalls, the intricate dance of gears and sensors it would require. He'd even found a few efficiencies on paper that the engineers had missed. But he hadn't voiced them, of course. "Good," Henderson continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Because I want you to lead it." The words hit Chester like a physical blow. "Lead it." The blood drained from his face, leaving a cold, hollow sensation. He could feel the familiar constriction in his chest, the tremor starting in his fingers. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, a polite way to decline. Too busy. Not enough experience, better suited for a behind-the-scenes role. Henderson, however, seemed to anticipate his internal struggle. He held up a hand. "Now I know what you're thinking. Chester, a leader, he barely talks. But I've watched you, son. You're meticulous. You catch details nobody else does. You planned out the inventory system last year, remember? Flawless. And you fixed that circuit board issue on line 2 last month, the one the external guys said was unfixable. You don't need to be a showman. You need to be damn good at what you do. And you are." He picked up a heavy binder, slapping it gently on the desk. "This is a crucial project, Chester. Months of planning, millions on the line. I need someone who won't miss a single thing, who'll think through every contingency. I need you." Henderson's gaze was unwavering, a challenge and an undeniable vote of confidence all at once. "You going to tell me you can't do it?" Chester swallowed hard. The question hung in the air, heavy, inescapable. His instinct screamed run. But something else, a tiny, defiant spark, flickered within him. It was the echo of his own frustration, of being tired of running. Henderson wasn't asking him to be someone he was. He was asking him to be the best version of the quiet, meticulous man he already was, and to do it out in the open. To say no would be to forever confirm every fear he'd ever had about himself. It would be to shrink one last time, to finally vanish entirely. He looked at Henderson, then at the blueprints, then back at his own trembling hands. He didn't know if he could do it, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had to try. "No, sir," Chester managed, his voice a dry rasp, barely audible. I can do it." Henderson just nodded, a slight knowing smile. "Good, now let's talk about resources." That night the house was a tomb. 3 o'clock in the morning, and Chester was wide awake, the silence of his modest home pressing in on him. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the worn carpet of his living room. He sat hunched on the edge of his threadbare armchair, the heavy binder Henderson had given him open on his lap, its crisp pages an accusing white in the dim light. His mind was a maelstrom. Every word Henderson had said echoed in his ears, twisting between praise and an impossible burden. You don't need to be a showman. You need to be damn good at what you do. But being damn good, he realized, still meant explaining, directing, interacting. It still meant 1,000 small confrontations with his own fear. He clutched the binder, his knuckles white. The thought of standing in front of a team, of answering questions from senior management, of having to articulate his decisions, made him feel physically ill. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He could feel the heat rising in his face, even in the cool night air. This was it. This was the moment he had always avoided, the spotlight he had meticulously sidestepped his entire life. He looked around his living room at the familiar, unchallenging objects, the old television, the bookshelf filled with technical manuals and a few dog-eared paperbacks, the faded floral print on the curtains. This was his sanctuary, his fortress against the world. He had built a life here, safe and predictable, but also sterile. No wife, no kids, no friends to speak of beyond a nodding acquaintance at the factory. Just the quiet hum of his own isolation. "What have you done, Chester?" he asked himself, the words echoing silently in the vast emptiness of his mind. He'd signed up for his own personal hell. He'd accepted the key to a cage he couldn't hide from, a cage built not by others, but by his own debilitating shyness. He'd lived a life where the highest ambition was to not be noticed, where success was the absence of failure, not the presence of triumph. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him, a sound he quickly muffled with a hand. He saw it all so clearly now, laid bare in the unforgiving glare of the 3 a.m. darkness. Every missed opportunity, every conversation left unsaid, every potential connection withered before it could bloom. He had become an expert at the technical because machines were predictable. They didn't judge. They didn't ask personal questions. They didn't expect eye contact. His life, he realized, was a carefully constructed exercise in avoidance. And now he was being asked to dismantle it piece by terrifying piece. He was 48 years old and still felt like that terrified kid who couldn't bring himself to answer a simple question in class. The thought was humiliating, crushing. Closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the worn fabric of the chair. He felt utterly, completely alone, adrift in a sea of self-doubt. The project wasn't just a retooling of Line 4. It was a retooling of Chester, and he had no idea if he had the courage to go through with it. The cold, hard truth of his situation settled over Chester like a shroud. He felt the weight of 48 years of quiet retreat, of being the man who faded into the background, the one who just got by. He saw the faint, ghostly outline of the life he could have lived, the chances he'd let slip through his fingers like sawdust. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of courage or a grand epiphany. It was much quieter, much more tired than that. "Enough," he whispered, the single word a rasp against the silence. It wasn't a roar of defiance, just a weary surrender to the fact that this path, the path of perpetual avoidance, was leading him nowhere good. It was a choice born not of bravery, but of sheer exhaustion. He didn't know how he would change, or even if he could. He just knew he couldn't keep doing this. The knot in his stomach might always be there, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to tie it into something useful. The next morning, the factory floor felt different. The usual clang and hum seemed to mock his new, fragile resolve. The project brief, tucked into his lunch pail, felt heavier than a lead ingot. It was day one of the Line 4 retooling, and the first informal meeting was set for 8 a.m. His gut was a tight, churning mess. He could feel the familiar cold sweat prickling at his hairline, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to find an excuse, to suddenly feel ill, to disappear into the labyrinthine back passages of the plant. But as he stared at the complex diagrams, the schematics for the new hydraulic system spread across his workbench, a different kind of urge began to surface. It wasn't about talking yet, not really. It was about knowing. If he was going to be terrified, he reasoned he might as well be prepared. If his anxiety was going to demand perfection, he'd feed it. He'd beat it at its own game. He pulled out his worn notebook, a pencil, and started poring over every last detail, tracing lines, cross-referencing specs, imagining every single possible point of failure, every potential question, every contingency. He wrote down notes, bullet points, even practiced the exact phrases he might need to use, whispering them under his breath, testing their sound. The knot was still there, a physical presence, but for the first time he was using it as fuel. He wasn't running. He was preparing. The clock crawled towards 8. When the moment finally arrived, Chester walked into the small conference room, the scent of stale coffee hanging in the air. 6 pairs of eyes, including Mr. Henderson, the plant manager, looked up. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His hands, though calloused from years of gripping wrenches and handling heavy parts, felt like they were shaking uncontrollably, even as he clasped them behind his back. He found an empty chair in the corner, a safe distance from the head of the table, and sank into it, trying to shrink himself. The discussion began, a blur of technical jargon and projected timelines. People spoke, debated, offered opinions, and Chester just listened, his mind a steel trap, every word absorbed. He felt the familiar weight of silence, the urge to contribute warring with the paralyzing fear of saying the wrong thing, of stumbling, of drawing attention. But then, as they delved into the specifics of the new hydraulic pump installation, a part he'd spent hours poring over, he noticed a discrepancy. Henderson was referring to a pressure tolerance that, according to the updated schematics, had been revised. His breath hitched. This was it. The moment. He could stay quiet, let it slide, and save himself the agony. Or he could speak up. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter, a cold hand squeezing his gut. He looked down at his own meticulously annotated project brief, the revised figure circled in red. He cleared his throat. It came out as a pathetic croak. He tried again, a little louder. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," he managed, his voice raspy, barely audible above the hum of the ventilation. All eyes turned to him. The blood rushed to his face, a hot wave of shame. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The P-17 pump. The spec sheet on page 3, section 4, it was updated last Tuesday. Tolerance moved to 180 psi, not 160. His words were stiff, like he was reading them from a script in his head, but they were precise. A hush fell. Henderson frowned, consulted his own much less marked-up binder. A moment later, his eyes widened slightly. "Well, I'll be, Chester, you're right. My apologies, folks, I was working off an older print." He looked at Chester, a hint of surprise, then respect in his gaze. "Good catch." Chester just nodded, unable to meet his eyes, feeling like he'd run a marathon. He hadn't spoken much more that day, but that single intervention, fueled by sheer terror and exhaustive preparation, had broken something. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't a speech, but it was right. And for the first time, his anxiety had pushed him to be useful, not just invisible. The next few days were a blur of the same excruciating process. Day 3, day 7. Each morning, the dread clawed at him anew. He'd wake before dawn, his mind already racing through the day's tasks, anticipating every possible interaction. He'd spend hours reviewing diagrams, reading manuals, jotting down notes on every wrench size, every bolt torque, every specific sequence of operations. He rehearsed conversations, arguments, explanations in the quiet solitude of his living room until his throat was sore. The constant mental exertion was exhausting, draining him physically and emotionally. There were moments he almost broke. During a planning session on day 7, a younger engineer, eager to make his mark, questioned one of Chester's proposed modifications to a conveyor belt alignment. Spoke quickly, confidently, rattling off formulas Chester hadn't encountered in years. The old panic flared, a white-hot wave threatening to drown him. His mind went blank. He felt the familiar paralysis seizing him, his mouth dry, words failing. He looked down at his hands, wishing he could disappear. But then a flicker. He remembered his notes, the countless hours he'd spent in the factory library, pulling out old engineering textbooks, cross-referencing industry standards. He hadn't just studied the new components, he'd revisited the foundational principles. He took a deep, shaky breath, forced himself to look up. "The tensile strength of the existing belt material at that pivot point," he said slowly, his voice still quiet but firm, "decreases by a calculated factor under sustained lateral stress. My modification accounts for that degradation over a 5-year operational cycle, preventing premature wear and potential breakage. The formula you cited assumes brand new material, not 20-year-old vulcanized rubber under constant strain." He even cited the specific ASTM standard from memory, a detail he'd drilled into his head just 2 nights prior. The young engineer blinked, then went quiet, shuffling his papers. Henderson nodded, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Good point, Chester. Always thinking ahead." It wasn't a triumph in the conventional sense. Chester still felt the tremor in his hands, the residual fear. He hadn't delivered a rousing speech or charmed the room. He'd simply stated a fact, backed by an almost obsessive level of preparation. But in that moment, he realized something profound. The fear hadn't gone away. It was still there, a constant companion, a heavy shadow. But now, instead of being a chain, it was a whip, lashing him into action, forcing him to dig deeper, to know more, to prepare harder than anyone else. He was channeling the current of his anxiety, redirecting its destructive power into meticulous, undeniable competence. The battle was far from over, but he was learning how to fight, not by overcoming the fear, but by using it. That quiet exchange with the young engineer, it was like the first tremor before an earthquake. Not a big, destructive one, but the kind that lets you know something deep in the earth is shifting. Chester didn't wake up the next day a changed man. The knot was still there, a cold, hard stone in his gut every morning. But now, when it tightened, he didn't just clench his jaw and brace for impact. He'd start looking for levers. He'd start sharpening his tools. A week later, the plant manager, Henderson, called a meeting about the new safety protocols for the hydraulic presses. Standard stuff, usually a drone of regulatory speak and a few confused questions from the floor. Chester, by habit, would have sat in the back, head down, praying not to be called on. But this time, fueled by that familiar hum of anxiety, he'd spent 2 evenings poring over the new schematics, cross-referencing them with the old models, even looking up case studies of similar machinery accidents. When Henderson paused, asking if anyone saw any potential snags with the proposed emergency shutoff placement, the room was mostly quiet. A few mumbled, "Looks good to me." But Chester, his heart hammering against his ribs, saw it. He saw the path the hydraulic fluid would take, the potential for a secondary pressure buildup even after the main pump disengaged, a blind spot in the design that could still cause a catastrophic failure under specific, rare conditions. He raised his hand, slow, deliberate, every eye in the room swiveled. He felt the heat rise to his face. For a moment, his voice deserted him, a dry rasp trapped in his throat. He cleared it, swallowed hard. "Sir," he managed, voice barely above a whisper, "the emergency shutoff, it bypasses the primary accumulator valve. In the event of a simultaneous electrical surge and a specific pressure spike from the feed line, the residual fluid inertia could still cause a piston override for approximately 1.7 seconds after system cutoff. It's a low probability, but there's a risk of what they call a ghost stroke if an operator's hand is in the wrong place during a very specific type of jam." He pointed to a small diagram on the handout, tracing the flow path with a steady finger, his voice gaining a quiet authority as he spoke facts. He even suggested a simple, inexpensive secondary bleed valve placement. Henderson looked at the lead engineer, whose brow was furrowed in concentration. Then at Chester, a flicker of something like awe in his eyes. "Chester, where did you—" "I just saw it in the schematics, sir," Chester mumbled, already retreating, the words having drained him, but the seed was planted. The engineer scribbled notes furiously. The suggestion was implemented, and in the break room later, Frank from maintenance, usually a man of few words, clapped Chester on the shoulder. "Ghost stroke, huh? Never even heard of that. Good catch, man." It wasn't much, just a pat on the back, but it felt like a spotlight had found him, not to expose his flaws, but to illuminate his quiet strength. Weeks turned into a couple of months. The retooling project gathered momentum. Chester was still the quiet man, the shadow at the edges, but the shadows he cast now were different. They held substance. When a problem arose on the line, people didn't just look to the supervisors anymore. They'd look for Chester. "Where's Chester?" "Bet he's got the answer." He wasn't talking more, not really. He was just speaking when it mattered. And when he spoke with the undeniable weight of meticulous truth. His anxiety, that old, familiar demon, was still there. It gnawed at him, pushing him to review blueprints until his eyes blurred, to simulate scenarios in his head until sleep was a distant memory. But now, when he delivered a solution, when his quiet insight prevented a costly mistake or sped up a process, the tremor in his hands was followed by a flicker of satisfaction, a tiny, almost imperceptible warmth that started to spread through his chest. The biggest test came when they had to present the final retooling plan to the corporate brass from out of town, the kind of sharp-suited folks who chewed up and spit out factory floor ideas like stale gum. Henderson wanted Chester to walk them through the most complex section, the reconfigured power distribution for the new robotics. Chester's stomach coiled like a spring. His first instinct was to say no, to find a dark corner and disappear. But then he remembered the night he almost said no to the project entirely, the dark night in his quiet house, the raw honesty. He thought about the ghost stroke, about Frank's pat on the shoulder. And he felt the fear hot and cold at once, but this time it came with a strange, familiar hum of purpose. "You're scared? Good. Use it." He spent the next 2 weeks living and breathing power distribution. He built a scale model in his garage, tracing wires, simulating loads, anticipating every single question a highly skeptical corporate executive might ask. He wrote down every possible point of failure, every efficiency gain, every cost-saving measure, and then he wrote down the counter-arguments to those points. He rehearsed until his voice was hoarse, talking to his reflection to the empty chairs in his living room. He didn't want to be brilliant. He just wanted to be flawless. He wanted to be so prepared that his shyness couldn't get a foothold, that his knowledge would simply be. On the day of the presentation, the conference room felt impossibly large. The corporate suits sat there, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Henderson introduced Chester, who walked to the whiteboard, his movements stiff, his mind racing. He gripped the marker, knuckles white. The fear was a roaring tide. But beneath it, a quiet confidence, forged in hours of relentless preparation, began to assert itself. He started talking, his voice low but clear, his gaze mostly fixed on the diagrams he was drawing. He didn't make eye contact often, but when he did, it was direct, almost piercing, as if he was looking through them, not at them. He broke down complex electrical loads, explained the new safety interlocks, detailed the energy consumption projections with an almost unnerving precision. He anticipated questions before they were asked, answering them in the flow of his explanation. When a particularly sharp-tongued executive tried to trip him up with a technical query about surge protection algorithms, Chester didn't falter. He simply laid out the exact calculations, the redundant systems, the cost-benefit analysis, all from memory, citing the specific manufacturer's specifications. The executive, a man notorious for cutting engineers off mid-sentence, listened, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. Then he leaned back in his chair, a look of grudging respect on his face. Chester finished, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. The room was silent. Then one of the corporate VPs, a silver-haired woman known for her icy demeanor, clapped. A single, sharp clap. Others followed, a ripple of applause. Henderson beamed. Chester felt a wave of relief so potent it almost buckled his knees. He hadn't charmed them. He hadn't won them over with charisma. He'd simply been undeniable. He walked out of that room, not a different man on the surface, but profoundly changed within. The knot was still there, sure. It probably always would be. But it wasn't a cage anymore. It was more like a highly tuned engine, an internal alarm system that now, instead of signaling danger, signaled a call to arms. It pushed him. It demanded more. It transformed him from the man who hid from mistakes to the man who prepared so thoroughly he made mistakes almost impossible. He was still Chester, the quiet factory man. But now, when people looked at him, they didn't just see the man who tried to be invisible. They saw the man who, when he spoke, held the answer. They saw the quiet intensity that wasn't aloofness, but a mind always working, always perfecting. They saw competence, quiet and steadfast, like a bedrock. And in that, for the first time in a long time, Chester saw a glimpse of the man he always wanted to be. Not loud, not flashy, but strong, reliable, and profoundly, quietly capable. Weeks later, the rhythm of the factory floor had changed, and so had Chester's place within it. He wasn't loud, never would be. He didn't suddenly start telling jokes or holding court in the break room. But his quiet was no longer a sign of absence, it was a sign of presence. Others noticed. When a problem arose, eyes would subtly shift towards Chester. Not out of expectation that he'd solve it with a grand declaration, but that he'd already thought about it, that he'd have the data, the schematic, the obscure technical manual page already marked. The retooling project moved forward with an almost unsettling smoothness, thanks in no small part to Chester. He didn't just anticipate potential issues. He had solutions drafted before the issues even showed their face. There was a moment, a particularly tense Tuesday, when a critical component from a new supplier arrived, slightly off-spec. The foreman, Mac, red-faced and yelling into his phone, was ready to shut down the line. Chester, without a word, walked over, pulled a folder from under his arm, a folder that looked exactly like the dozen others he carried daily, and laid out a supplementary design Mac had never seen. Saw this might be an issue. Chester mumbled, pointing to the precise discrepancy on the supplier's schematic he'd acquired weeks ago. Already worked out a shim for it. Got a few prototypes in the back. Mac just stared, then nodded slowly, a bewildered respect dawning in his eyes. The line didn't stop. Chester still got the knot in his stomach. Every presentation, every unexpected question, every time he had to explain a complex procedure to a group of men staring back at him, the old fear tried to creep in. But now he had a different relationship with it. He didn't fight it. He used it. That churn in his gut became the urgency that made him double-check the torque settings, the fear of forgetting a detail that made him draw up contingency plans for his contingency plans. His shyness, once a heavy cloak he hid beneath, had become the meticulous, almost obsessive drive that made him undeniably good. He wasn't not anxious, he was just more prepared than anyone else because of it. He sat on his porch late one evening watching the streetlights flicker on, a rare moment of quiet reflection. "You know," he murmured to himself, the words feeling foreign, "I used to just run from it, that knot in my stomach. I thought it was a weakness. I thought it meant I wasn't cut out for anything more than keeping my head down." He took a slow breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. "But then I figured if I'm gonna be that worried, if I'm gonna feel that awful every time I think about screwing up, I might as well put it to use." A faint smile touched his lips. "So now, when I get nervous about something, I just prepare harder. I check everything twice, then I check it again. I imagine every dumb thing that could possibly go wrong, and then I figure out how to stop it." He looked at his calloused hands, hands that had once felt clumsy and hesitant. Turns out being scared of messing up can make you really good at not messing up. It ain't about being fearless, no sir. It's about using that fear to make sure you're ready for anything. It's about turning the thing that holds you back into the thing that pushes you forward. And that's the thing about those quiet, watchful men, the ones you see on the edges, observing from the shadows. You might think they're invisible, but sometimes they're just